My daughter Vanessa looked at me across my own dining table and said the words like she was reading a grocery list. "You're not our father anymore, Dad. You're a liability with a pulse, and liabilities get managed." Nobody moved. The old grandfather clock in the hallway kept ticking, the only sound in the room besides the faint hum of the refrigerator 2 rooms away. Derek's pen, which had been tapping a soft rhythm against his leather folder, went still. My son Michael, sitting at the far end of the table, stared down at his untouched coffee and did not lift his eyes. I sat there in the chair I had eaten breakfast in for 31 years, and for a moment I understood exactly how an old book feels when it gets pulled off a shelf, flipped through once, and set down on the clearance table by the door, marked down to nothing because nobody remembers why it mattered in the first place. My name is Walter Hensley. I am 64 years old. For 38 years, I authenticated rare manuscripts, historical letters, and antique documents for auction houses and private collectors. The kind of work where a single misplaced watermark or a wrong shade of iron gall ink can turn $1 million discovery into worthless paper. 4 months before that night at my dining table, I buried my wife of 39 years, Margaret, after a 2-year fight with congestive heart failure that ended on a Tuesday morning while I was holding her hand and reading to her from a book of poems she'd loved since college. 3 weeks before that dinner, my daughter and her husband started telling me I was forgetting things I had never said. Before I tell you what was written on page 7 and how a piece of paper worth nothing to anyone but me ended up being the thing that took down 2 people who thought they had already won, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. If you've ever had someone you loved try to convince you that your own mind was the enemy, hit that like button and subscribe. Because tonight I'm going to show you exactly what happens when you underestimate a man who spent his whole career catching liars for a living. By the end of that week, someone in my family was going to lose everything they'd built their entire scheme around, and it wasn't going to be me. To understand how I ended up sitting at my own table listening to my daughter call me a liability, you have to go back 3 weeks, to the first morning Vanessa started rearranging my house. Margaret had been gone 109 days. I know the number because I had started counting the way you count anything that hurts, quietly, without meaning to, the number just sitting there in the back of your mind, like a splinter you can't dig out. 40 years we ran Hensley Rare Books and manuscript appraisals together out of a converted carriage house behind our home in Fairhaven, a small operation that had, over 4 decades, become one of the most trusted names in document authentication on the East Coast. We started with $1,100, a card table, and a magnifying loupe Margaret bought me for our first anniversary. We built it into a business worth, by conservative estimate, $8 million in inventory, client relationships, and reputation alone. The kind of number that sounds impressive until you remember it came from 4 decades of missed vacations, of Margaret keeping the books at the kitchen table until midnight, of me driving through ice storms to authenticate a single letter, because a client couldn't wait until the roads cleared. I still couldn't sit at that kitchen table. I ate standing up at the counter most mornings, my coffee cooling in my hand, because the chair across from mine had a cushion worn into the exact shape of 39 years of Margaret sitting in it, and some mornings I could not make myself look at it. That was where I was standing, coffee cooling, when Vanessa let herself in with her own key at 7:15 in the morning, 3 weeks before the dinner, where she called me a liability. She was 44, sharp and polished the way she'd been since law school, though she'd left the law firm 8 years ago to support Derek's practice, a decision I'd never fully understood but never questioned either, because it wasn't my business to question my daughter's marriage. She had a canvas tote bag over her shoulder, and she set it on the counter and started pulling out containers of prepared meals, the kind you get delivered, portioned and labeled. "I thought I'd stock the fridge," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "You've been forgetting to eat." I told her I had not, in fact, been forgetting to eat, that I simply preferred my toast standing up these days. And she gave me a look I didn't like, a look that lingered a half second too long, the way you look at someone when you've already decided something about them and you're just watching for the evidence to catch up. Dad, she said. Michael said you called him twice last week asking the same question. I had not called Michael twice asking the same question. I told her so. She said it didn't matter, that these things happen, that I shouldn't be embarrassed. I stood there with my cooling coffee and felt something shift in the room, subtle as a change in air pressure before a storm, and I didn't yet have a name for what it was, but my hands, trained for 4 decades to notice when something in front of me wasn't quite what it claimed to be, prickled the way they used to when a client brought me a first edition that was actually a very good facsimile. That was the beginning, though I didn't know it yet. Small things. My reading glasses, which I kept in the same ceramic dish by the front door for 11 years, went missing twice in 1 week, only to turn up in the junk drawer, a place I never put anything. A doctor's appointment I had never made appeared on the calendar in the kitchen, and when I called the office to cancel it, the receptionist told me Vanessa had scheduled it herself, using my name. Derek started stopping by on his lunch breaks, always with a reason, always leaving behind some small piece of paperwork he wanted me to just glance at when I had a minute. Documents with dense financial language I would set aside and never quite get around to reading, because grief, it turns out, makes you slow in ways you don't expect. And slow is exactly what someone needs you to be if they're building a case against your mind. I should tell you a little about who I was before all this, so you understand what my daughter and her husband were actually trying to dismantle. I built my career on patience most people don't have anymore, the kind that lets you sit with a single document for 6 hours, checking paper fiber under UV light, cross-referencing ink chemistry against known dates, until you can say with total certainty whether the thing in front of you is real or a lie dressed up convincingly. I authenticated a Lincoln letter once that 3 other examiners had already called genuine, and I was the one who found the anachronism buried in the paper stock that proved it was a fraud manufactured in the 1920s. I never raised my voice about it. I just laid out the proof, page by page, until there was nothing left to argue with. Margaret used to say, I had the patience of a man who'd never been in a hurry in his life, and the temper of a man who'd never needed to raise it, because the truth, when you finally lay it all out in the right order, does the shouting for you. But I want to be honest with you, because I'm not interested in standing up here and pretending I was some flawless old sage sitting quietly through all of this with a saint's composure. I wasn't. There was a night, maybe 2 weeks after Margaret's funeral, when my 6-year-old granddaughter, Lily, Michael's daughter, called to ask if she could come stay with Grandpa for the weekend like she used to, and I told her not this weekend, sweetheart. And then I sat in my study with the phone still in my hand for 20 minutes afterward, because I could not make myself dial her back, could not make myself sound normal enough for a 6-year-old not to hear that something in me was broken. I avoided that phone call for 3 more days. It is a small thing, I know, next to everything else in this story, but it's the truth. And the truth is that grief made me a worse father and grandfather for a stretch of months than I had any right to be. And some of what happened later, I have to admit, took root in a season where I was not fully present for the people who needed me, including the daughter who would eventually try to take everything from me. I didn't know it yet, but that absence, that season of me being present in body and absent everywhere else, was exactly the kind of soil Derek Cole knew how to plant something in. Derek was 47, a wealth manager with an office downtown and a reputation, at least publicly, for being the kind of steady, conservative advisor that nervous retirees trusted with their life savings. He'd married Vanessa 18 years ago, and I'd spent most of those 18 years telling myself the low hum of unease I felt around him was just an old man's instinct to distrust anyone who wore his watch a size too big and talked a little too smoothly about numbers. Margaret liked him more than I did, or at least she was better at hiding her doubts. He makes her happy, she used to say, and I'd let that be enough, because what does a father know about who makes his daughter happy? Beyond what she tells him herself, 2 weeks into the forgetting campaign, Derek came by on a Thursday evening with a leather folder and a bottle of the scotch I liked, and he sat across from me in my study with the particular warmth of a man who has rehearsed his kindness in a mirror. "Walter," he said, "Vanessa's worried sick about you. We all are. I want to talk to you about something called a durable power of attorney, just as a precaution. Nothing dramatic, just good planning." I told him I already had a power of attorney, drawn up 11 years ago with my own lawyer, naming Margaret first, and since her death, naming my longtime attorney and old friend Charles Whitfield as successor. Derek's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes recalculated, the way I'd seen a forger's face shift once he realized I'd caught the anachronism in his ink. "That's an old document," he said smoothly. "Things change. We just want to make sure someone in the family has the authority to help you day to day, someone who's actually here." I told him I would think about it. He left the folder anyway, a stack of papers dense with the kind of financial and legal language designed to be skimmed rather than read, and for one evening, exhausted and hollow, the way I still was most evenings, I nearly did skim it. I nearly set it in the pile with the others, the pile I wasn't getting around to. Instead, something Margaret used to say stopped my hand. She had a habit. Whenever we reviewed a contract or a provenance document together at the kitchen table, of saying, "Page 7 holds more truth than the whole rest of the book, Walter, because that's where people bury what they don't want you reading twice." It was a joke between us, born from an actual case decades ago, where a forger had buried the real terms of a fraudulent deed exactly on page 7 of a 12-page contract, betting correctly that most people's attention had worn thin by then. I heard her voice say it in my head, clear as if she were standing behind my chair, and instead of setting Derek's folder aside, I turned straight to page 7. It was a provision granting the appointed agent, meaning Derek, broad authority over all business assets, intellectual property, and appraisal inventory belonging to Hensley Rare Books and Manuscript Appraisals, with language specifically permitting the agent to sell, transfer, or liquidate inventory without requiring the principal's contemporaneous consent, in cases where the agent determines such action serves the principal's best financial interest. I sat in my study a long time that night with that page in my hands. My business, the one Margaret and I built from a card table in $1,100, the one that now held, among other things, an $8 million inventory of rare and irreplaceable documents entrusted to me by collectors and institutions who believed I was still sharp enough to be trusted with pieces of history, was one signature away from Derek Cole's discretion, with no requirement that he even tell me before he moved a single piece of it. I didn't sign anything that night. I told Derek, the next time he asked, that my old lawyer Charles was reviewing it, which was a lie, the first outright lie I'd told either of them, and it sat in my stomach uncomfortably because I had spent my whole career punishing other people's lies with cold, careful proof, and here I was telling a small one just to buy myself room to think. I didn't know it yet, but buying that room to think was the only reason any of what came later was even possible. The next morning, I did something I should have done the moment I noticed my reading glasses moving themselves into the junk drawer. I called Dr. Patricia Kim, a geriatric psychiatrist, 2 towns over, who I'd never met, but who came recommended by a colleague at Cavendish House Auctions, as someone with no connection whatsoever to my family, my business, or Fairhaven's small social circle. I told her nothing except that I wanted a full, independent cognitive and competency evaluation, done properly, with documentation. I paid for it myself, out of an account Derek didn't know existed. A small personal savings account I'd kept separate from the business for 40 years, out of nothing more than an old habit Margaret used to tease me about. I sat for 2.5 hours across from Dr. Kim 8 days later while she ran me through memory tests, reasoning exercises, and a long, careful conversation about my daily life, my finances, my understanding of the documents Derek had been leaving on my desk. She was thorough in a way that reminded me, oddly, of my own work, the same patient refusal to accept a surface answer when a deeper one was available. At the end of the session, she looked at me over her glasses and said, "Mr. Hensley, I want to be direct with you. There is nothing in this evaluation that suggests any cognitive impairment. Your memory, your reasoning, your executive function are all well within the normal range for a man your age, and frankly, sharper than most. I don't say this lightly. Whatever is happening in your family, it isn't happening inside your mind. I asked her, because by then the shape of something ugly was starting to form in my chest, whether it was possible for someone to manufacture the appearance of decline in a person who didn't have any. She told me it happened more often than people wanted to believe, that she'd seen cases where family members deliberately hid items, misreported conversations, and isolated an elderly relative specifically to build a paper trail toward guardianship, and that if I had any concerns along those lines, I should keep her report somewhere safe, because a properly conducted independent evaluation was exactly the kind of document that could unravel a manufactured narrative in front of a judge. I asked her to put her full findings in writing, every test, every score, every conclusion, formatted the way she would for any court proceeding. She told me it would run about 9 pages. I told her that was fine. I already knew, with the strange, quiet certainty that had guided my whole career, exactly which page I would be circling when it arrived. I drove home that afternoon with the appointment behind me and no report yet in hand, and I sat in my driveway for a few minutes before going inside, looking at my own house, the porch light Margaret always left on even in daylight, because she said a house should look like it was expecting someone good to come home. I thought about the folder in my study, about Vanessa's canvas tote bag full of meals I hadn't asked for, about a 6-year-old granddaughter I'd been too hollowed out to call back. I thought about the version of myself that had spent 4 decades finding the exact page where a lie was hiding, and I understood that whatever this was, whatever my daughter and her husband were building toward, I was not going to meet it as a grieving old man standing at his kitchen counter. I was going to meet it as the man I had always been before grief made me forget it for a while. I didn't know it yet, but I had exactly 11 days left before Vanessa would sit across from me at my own table and call me a liability with a pulse, and in those 11 days I was going to need every hour of it. Michael was the one who finally told me the truth, though it took him 11 more days and a granddaughter's question to get there. I spent the first few of those days doing quietly what I had done for 38 years. I went to my own evidence and I looked at it properly instead of setting it aside. I still had, tucked in the back of my study safe behind the business ledgers, a small collection of what Margaret and I privately called our family provenance, letters, cards, and notes we'd written each other across 4 decades, the same category of object I'd spent my career authenticating for other people's families. Among them was a short letter Margaret had written me 11 years earlier, during a stretch when her mother's estate was being settled and we'd argued, gently, about whether the business should someday pass to Vanessa or to Michael, or be split evenly, an argument we never fully resolved, because neither of our children had shown much interest in rare documents, and because we'd assumed, the way you do when you're not yet 60 and not yet sick, that we had decades left to decide. 3 days after my appointment with Dr. Kim, Derek came by again, this time with Vanessa beside him, and this time the folder he set on my desk contained something new, a photocopy of a handwritten letter, purportedly from Margaret, dated 8 months before her death, stating in plain terms that she wanted the business to pass fully into Vanessa's care and Derek's management upon my death or incapacity, so that Walter would never have to carry the burden alone. I want to tell you what it feels like to hold a piece of paper claiming to be in the handwriting of the woman you were married to for 39 years, a woman whose handwriting you would know blind, drunk, or half asleep, and to feel your own trained eye start cataloging everything wrong with it before your heart has even caught up to what you're looking at. The loop of the lowercase g was wrong, closed instead of open. The way Margaret always wrote it after a broken wrist in 1994 left her with a slight permanent hitch in that one letter. The ink, even in photocopy, sat too evenly across the page, lacking the faint pressure variance of a hand that had been failing for months, a hand I had watched grow weaker letter by letter across every card she wrote me in her final year, and the date, 8 months before her death would have placed this letter in a stretch of 3 straight weeks when Margaret was hospitalized for a cardiac episode, unable to sit up long enough to write more than a signature on a hospital form, let alone compose a full page. I told Derek and Vanessa I would need to see the original, not a photocopy, to properly consider it, and Derek said, smooth as ever, that the original was somewhere safe and he'd track it down. I watched my daughter's face while he said it. She didn't look at him. She looked down at her hands, and for just a moment I saw something in her expression I hadn't seen in a long time. Something that looked less like triumph and more like a woman standing very still because she was afraid of what might happen if she moved. I didn't know it yet, but that flicker was the first real crack in the thing Derek had built, and it would take my son to finally pull it open. Michael came to see me alone 4 days later, on a Sunday afternoon, without calling first, which wasn't like him. He stood in my kitchen doorway for a long moment before he came in, and when he finally sat down across from me at the table, in the chair that had been empty for 120-some days by then, I saw that his hands were shaking slightly around his coffee mug. "Dad," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." He told me that 18 months earlier, before Margaret got sick, Derek had helped him with what Michael described at the time as a bridge loan, $40,000 to cover a bad year at the small private school where he taught history, a year where the school's budget crisis had cut his hours and he and his wife had fallen behind on their mortgage. Derek hadn't structured it as a loan from a bank. He'd structured it as a private arrangement, off the books, with an interest schedule that had quietly ballooned the debt to nearly $70,000. And 6 weeks ago, right around the time Vanessa started stocking my refrigerator with meals I hadn't asked for, Derek had sat Michael down and told him that if Michael didn't stay quiet and go along with the plan for Dad's care, he'd call the loan due in full with a lien against Michael's house that Michael hadn't fully understood he'd signed. "I didn't know what the plan even was," Michael said, staring at the table. "I swear to you, Dad, I didn't know it was this. I thought it was just, I don't know, helping out, making sure you weren't alone. And then I saw the guardianship paperwork on Vanessa's counter last week, and I saw your name on it, and the word incompetent, and I've been sick about it for 6 days, and I didn't say anything because I was scared of losing the house, and I hate myself for that, and I'm sorry." I sat with that for a long moment. I want to tell you that my first instinct was fury, because it should have been, and some part of it was. But mostly what I felt, looking at my son's shaking hands around that coffee mug, was something closer to recognition, the uncomfortable kind, the kind where you see your own recent failures reflected back at you from someone you love. I had gone silent with my own grief for months, avoided a phone call from a 6-year-old girl because I couldn't manage the sound of my own voice pretending to be fine. Michael had gone silent out of fear for his family's house. Neither of us had done right by the people who needed us, and I understood, sitting there, that I did not have the standing to be purely angry at my son for a silence I had been guilty of myself, in a smaller and quieter way, for months. "You should have told me the day you saw that paperwork," I said. "But I understand why you didn't, and I'm not going to pretend I've been perfect this year either. I let a lot of silence build up in this family after your mother died. Some of that's on me." Michael looked up at me then, and something in his face broke open, the careful composure of a grown man cracking the way it does when someone finally gives him permission to stop holding a weight alone. He came around the table and put his arms around me, the first real embrace either of us had managed since the funeral, both of us stiff and unpracticed at it, and we stood there in that kitchen for a long moment, two men who didn't hug easily, holding on anyway. When we sat back down, he told me one more thing, almost as an afterthought, the kind of detail a person mentions only after they've already handed over the harder truth. Derek had a new car in his driveway, a car Michael happened to know from an offhand comment Derek had made at a family barbecue 2 months earlier, was not something the wealth management firm's public bonus structure could have paid for, not on the timeline it had appeared. And there had been a woman, once, at Derek's office that Michael had seen him with at a downtown restaurant during a lunch hour, when he was supposed to be meeting clients, a woman who was not Vanessa, sitting close, laughing at something Derek said with the particular ease of two people who'd had that same lunch many times before. I didn't know yet exactly what any of that meant, but I had spent my career learning that when you find one small anachronism in a document, you don't stop looking, because forgers rarely make only one mistake. That same evening, my granddaughter Lily called, the way she used to before I'd started letting her calls go to voicemail out of my own private cowardice. This time I answered on the second ring. "Grandpa," she said. 6 years old and entirely unaware of anything happening around her except the thing that mattered most to a 6-year-old. "Mommy said maybe you're going to go live somewhere else soon, somewhere with nurses. If you go live there, who's going to read me the pirate book? You do the voices right, and nobody else does the voices right." I sat in my study with the phone against my ear and found myself, for the first time in 120-some days, laughing. A real laugh, startled out of me by the plain, devastating clarity of a child's question, cutting straight through every layer of legal language, every folder, every careful manipulation Derek had constructed, down to the only question that actually mattered. Who is going to be there for the people who need you? I told her nobody was taking me anywhere, that I would always do the voices, and after we hung up I sat there a while longer, holding on to that small, fierce certainty the way you hold onto a rope. I called Charles Whitfield the next morning, my attorney and old friend of 30 years, and I told him everything. The power of attorney with page 7 buried in it, the forged letter with the wrong loop on the lowercase g, Dr. Kim's evaluation on its way, Michael's confession about the loan and the lien, Derek's unexplained car, and his lunches with a woman who wasn't my daughter. Charles listened without interrupting, the way he always did, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment before he said, "Walter, as the sole owner and trustee of your own assets and business, you have every legal right now, today, to unilaterally amend your estate plan and your business succession documents to remove anyone you choose as a beneficiary or agent. You don't need their permission. You don't need to convince them of anything. You need a properly drafted amendment, my signature as witness, and a notary, and it's done within the week." I told him I wanted to do exactly that, but not quietly, and not yet. I wanted to give them one more chance to show me who they actually were before I acted, and I wanted, when the moment came, for it to happen somewhere that mattered, somewhere Margaret would have wanted it to happen. Charles asked what I had in mind. I reminded him about the library. 8 months before she died, Margaret and I had been approached by the Fairhaven Public Library about donating a portion of our personal manuscript collection, letters and documents too personally meaningful to sell, but too significant to keep locked away forever, to establish a permanent reading room in her name, a quiet space where researchers and students could study primary historical documents the way she'd always believed people should, with their hands, not just their screens. The dedication ceremony had been scheduled for months, a small community event, nothing grand, but it fell exactly 11 days after that Sunday afternoon in my kitchen, and it would be attended by the library board, a handful of old colleagues from Cavendish House, and whatever family chose to show up. "That's where I'll do it," I told Charles. "Not in a courtroom, not in a lawyer's office, in the room with her name on it." Charles began drafting the amendment that week, quietly, with Dr. Kim's full 9-page evaluation arriving by courier 4 days later, its conclusion on page 9 unambiguous in its methodology, on the pages before it, thorough enough to withstand any challenge. I read it twice, start to finish, sitting at my kitchen table in the chair across from Margaret's, and for the first time since her funeral, I made myself sit there through an entire cup of coffee without moving to the counter. I still had 11 days to get through before the dinner, where Vanessa would call me a liability with a pulse, though I didn't yet know she'd choose that particular night to push for a signature, forcing the confrontation before the ceremony rather than after it. I spent those days doing 3 things: gathering every piece of proof Charles and I would need, quietly reaching out to the state's Financial Regulatory Board with a formal, legitimate complaint requesting a routine audit of Derek Cole's client trust accounts at his firm, based on the pattern of unexplained personal spending Michael had described to me, filed the way any concerned family member is legally entitled to file it, through proper channels, with no hacking, no illegal access, nothing but a documented request for an official review, and spending every evening I could with Lily, reading the pirate book, doing all the voices, letting a 6-year-old remind me, page by page, what I still had left to protect. On the 9th of those 11 days, Vanessa called and told me Derek wanted to ginalize things over dinner that Thursday, before the library ceremony on Saturday, so that, in her words, everything would be settled and I wouldn't have to worry about it hanging over me during such an emotional weekend. I understood, hearing the practiced gentleness in her voice, that they intended to have my signature on their guardianship agreement locked in before I ever stood up in that reading room, before Margaret's name on the wall could give me any more courage than they'd already decided I had left. I told her Thursday would be fine. I hung up the phone, sat back in my chair, and opened the drawer where I kept a plain cream envelope I had sealed 6 days earlier, Dr. Kim's full report folded neatly inside it. The number 7 marked lightly in pencil on the outside corner, where only I would know to look for it. I didn't know exactly what Thursday night would cost any of us, but I knew, the way I'd always known, when a forgery was about to fail its own test under the light, that it was coming and that I would be ready for it when it did. The dinner Vanessa had scheduled was set for 7 o'clock Thursday evening, and I arrived at the table exactly as I had every night for 31 years, in my own dining room, though this time I brought with me a plain cream envelope and a folder of my own thin compared to Derek's usual stack, holding only what I needed and nothing more. Derek got to the point before the appetizer plates were even cleared, sliding his leather folder across the table with the same rehearsed warmth he'd used 2 weeks earlier over the scotch. Inside was the finalized guardianship and estate management agreement, the language dressed up in phrases like voluntary supported decision-making and family care coordination, but underneath all of it, the same page 7 provision I'd already read once, now formalized. Full discretionary control over Hensley rare books and manuscript appraisals, its inventory, its accounts, and my personal estate, transferred to Derek as managing agent, with Vanessa listed as co-agent in name only. "We had Dr. Reyes complete a formal evaluation last week, Dad," Vanessa said, sliding a second, thinner document across the table, a single-page letter on letterhead I didn't recognize, signed by a psychiatrist I had never met, dated 3 days after my own real evaluation with Dr. Kim. Its conclusion stating in clinical language that I showed early indicators of mild cognitive impairment consistent with the early stages of vascular dementia. "We know this is hard to hear, but we love you, and we're not going to sit back and watch you lose everything Mom built because you're too proud to accept help." It was Vanessa who said it then, the sentence I'd already told you at the start of all this, the one about liabilities and pulses, and I watched Michael's face go pale beside her, and I felt the old grandfather clock in the hallway keep its patient ticking through the silence that followed. And I let that silence sit exactly as long as it needed to. I did not raise my voice. I did not reach for either of their documents. I reached instead into my jacket pocket and set the plain cream envelope down on the table between us, the pencil mark on the corner facing up where only I would recognize it. "Before either of you asks me to sign anything tonight," I said, "I want you to read page 7 of what's inside that envelope first." Vanessa's hand, already moving toward the guardianship agreement, and the pen Derek had set beside it, stopped where it was. I watched something pass across her face, not confusion exactly, more like the particular stillness of a person who has spent weeks building toward a moment and suddenly senses the ground shifting under it before she understands why. Derek reached for the envelope instead, tore it open with more confidence than his hands quite managed to sustain, and pulled out Dr. Kim's 9-page evaluation. I watched him flip past the first 6 pages of methodology, test results, and clinical notes, his jaw tightening slightly with each one until he reached page 7, where Dr. Kim's conclusion sat in plain, unambiguous language. Full cognitive competency, no impairment detected. Patient demonstrates reasoning and judgment consistent with and, in several measures, exceeding normative ranges for his age group, with a formal notation that the evaluation had been conducted independently, without referral from or contact with any family member, at the patient's own request and expense. This is dated 8 days after Dr. Reyes's letter, I said quietly. Dr. Kim has never met either of you. She has never spoken to anyone in this family except me. I paid for it out of an account neither of you have ever known existed, specifically, so no one could say it was influenced by anything happening in this house. Derek set the report down slowly. This doesn't mean anything, he said, though his voice had lost some of its practiced smoothness. One doctor's opinion against another's. It's not unusual for evaluations to differ. It's a little more than that, I said, and I want you to understand that I said it the way I used to lay out proof of a forgery for a client who still didn't want to believe the beautiful thing they'd paid for was fake, patiently, without cruelty, because the facts were going to do the work whether I raised my voice or not. I had the letter you brought me last week looked at, the one supposedly written by Margaret 8 months before she died. The loop on the lowercase g doesn't match her hand after 1994, when a broken wrist changed how she wrote that letter for the rest of her life. The ink pressure is inconsistent with a hand as weak as hers was during that period. And that specific stretch of 8 months before she died included 3 straight weeks when she was hospitalized and physically unable to write more than her signature on a hospital form. I've spent 38 years authenticating documents for a living, Vanessa. I know my wife's handwriting better than either of you know your own. I did not say the word forged. I have learned, across 4 decades of this work, that you don't need to say the word out loud when the evidence has already said it for you. Vanessa's face had gone very still, the color draining out of it in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with fear. And I understood, watching her, that whatever this had cost her, she had not fully known what she was signing herself into either. I did not go further at the table that night. I had promised myself, driving over, that whatever I found in her face when the truth started to surface, I would not humiliate my daughter in front of her brother over numbers and letterhead. She may not have fully understood herself. Some things needed to happen privately first. Derek, I said, I'd like to speak with you alone for a moment. In my study, he followed me, his confidence visibly thinning with every step down the hallway, and once the study door was closed, I told him the rest of it, quietly, without an audience, the way Charles and I had agreed was the right way to do it, that the State Financial Regulatory Board had opened a formal, legitimate review of his firm's client trust accounts, initiated through a properly filed complaint, not through anything illegal, based on a documented pattern of personal spending that didn't reconcile with his disclosed income, that I knew about the loan he'd used to pressure Michael into silence, with a lien Michael hadn't fully understood he'd signed, and that I knew, because my son had seen it with his own eyes, about a woman who was not my daughter, and lunches that happened with the practiced ease of 2 people who'd had that lunch many times before. Derek didn't deny any of it. That was the part that surprised me most, watching him standing there in my study, the leather folder still tucked uselessly under his arm. He sat down heavily in the chair across from my desk, the same chair he'd sat in 2 weeks earlier with the scotch and the rehearsed kindness, and something in him seemed to collapse inward, the way a structure does once you've found the single load-bearing lie holding the whole thing up and pulled it loose. I needed the collection, he said, quiet now. None of the smoothness left in his voice. The audit at the firm was coming regardless of anything you did, Walter. I've been moving client funds to cover positions that went bad, and I needed liquid collateral fast, real collateral, something a bank or a regulator would accept without asking too many questions about where it came from. Your inventory was worth more than my entire book of business. I told myself I'd put it back once things stabilized. I told myself Vanessa would never have to know how bad it actually was. I asked him whether Vanessa had known any of that, the trust fund shortfall, the real reason behind the guardianship push, and he shook his head slowly. She thought this was about taking care of you, he said. She thought it was about making sure the business didn't get mismanaged while you were grieving. I let her believe that because it was easier than telling her the truth, which is that I'd already put us both underwater trying to fix something I broke 2 years ago, and this was the only way out I could see. I sat with that for a moment. My own daughter, 44 years old, sharp enough to have finished law school, apparently manipulated by her own husband into believing she was protecting her father when she was actually being used as the instrument of a much larger and much more selfish collapse. I felt something complicated move through me, not forgiveness, exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it, a recognition that the person across my dining table earlier that night calling me a liability with a pulse had, in her own way, also been lied to. I did not confront Vanessa with the financial numbers that night. Charles and Dr. Kim's report had already done what needed doing at the table. I told Derek that the guardianship agreement was dead, that I would be amending my own estate documents within the week, using powers that had always been mine to exercise, that the regulatory review of his accounts would proceed regardless of anything either of us said in that room, and that whatever happened between him and Vanessa going forward was between the two of them, but that he would not be managing one page of my business, my inventory, or my estate, not now, not ever. He left that night without another word to me, and Vanessa left with him, though I watched from the front window as she stood by the car for a long moment before getting in, looking back at the house. At the porch light, Margaret always left on even in daylight, with an expression I couldn't quite read from that distance, but one that didn't look like a woman who had won anything. Michael stayed behind. We sat in the kitchen together, both of us at the table this time, both chairs occupied for the first time in 130-some days, and I told him everything Derek had confessed in the study. He put his head in his hands and was quiet a long while, and then he said, "Dad, I should have told you the day I saw that lien paperwork. I let fear about a house keep me quiet while you sat here thinking you were losing your family over your own mind. That's on me, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. You're not the only one in this family who let fear keep him quiet this year," I told him, and I meant it. I let 3 days go by once without calling Lily back, because I couldn't stand the sound of my own voice. If we're going to be honest about where we all fell short, I'm not standing outside that circle. We talked past midnight that night, the way we hadn't in years, about Margaret, about the business, about what came next, and for the first time since the funeral, the silence in that house didn't feel like something pressing down on me. It felt like a house getting ready, slowly to be lived in again. Saturday came clear and cold, the kind of bright autumn morning Margaret always loved, and by 2 in the afternoon, the Margaret Hensley reading room at the Fairhaven Public Library was filling with more people than I had expected. The library board was there, of course, along with a small crowd of old colleagues from Cavendish House Auctions, several of them people I'd quietly helped over the years, waived fees for young appraisers just starting out, mentored through their first authentication disputes without ever asking for anything in return, people I hadn't invited but who had heard about the dedication and come anyway. They stood along the back wall in a loose, unassuming cluster, not making a scene of their presence, just being there, the way people show up for someone who once showed up for them without being asked to. Charles stood near the front with a manila folder of his own, the amended trust documents inside it, ready and waiting, though I had told him I wanted this part of it to happen quietly off to the side, not as a performance in front of the whole room. Vanessa arrived alone, without Derek, in a plain coat, looking smaller somehow than she had at my dining table 2 nights earlier. She found me near the reading room's new brass plaque, Margaret's name etched into it, beside the dates of her life. And for a long moment neither of us said anything. "I didn't know what he was actually doing with the firm's accounts," she said finally, her voice low enough that it wouldn't carry. "I want you to know that. I believed I was protecting you. I've been sick since Thursday night, trying to figure out how much of what I believed was even true." "I know," I said. "Derek told me himself, Saturday morning, over the phone, before he left town. He's not going to be part of this family's business going forward, And what happens with the regulators is out of anyone's hands now but his own. I watched her absorb that, watched the particular grief of realizing your whole marriage had been a structure, built on a lie you weren't shown until it was already collapsing. But I don't think you belong in the same sentence as what he did, Vanessa. I think you got used, the same way I nearly did. It was Michael, standing a few feet away with Lily's hand in his, who spoke up then, loud enough for the small cluster of people nearby to hear, cutting cleanly across whatever careful, private moment Vanessa and I had been having. For what it's worth, he said, our dad spent 40 years building something honest, and the last 2 months he spent proving on his own, with nothing but his own patience and his own 2 eyes, that he still had every bit of the mind he's always had. I watched him do it. I'm proud to be his son, and I think everyone in this room should know that before anyone says another word about him today. A few people near the back, colleagues who'd known me for decades, murmured agreement, not loudly, not for show, just the quiet solidarity of people who already believed it and were glad to hear it said out loud. Charles caught my eye from across the room and gave a small nod, and I understood it was time. I did not stand up in front of the whole reading room and read financial figures or forged letters aloud. That was never the plan, and it would have been the wrong way to close this out, in a room built to honor careful, patient truth rather than public spectacle. Instead, once the formal dedication had finished, once the ribbon had been cut, and the small crowd had begun moving through the room admiring the letters and manuscripts Margaret and I had donated, I found a quiet corner with Charles and signed the amended trust documents there, simply, with a notary Charles had arranged in advance standing by. The business, the inventory, the estate, all of it remained solely mine, under my sole discretion, exactly as it had always legally been, with the amendment formally removing any prior designation, naming Derek as an agent of any kind. Vanessa, as the one family member who had ever held any beneficiary standing in the original documents, signed a simple acknowledgement, drafted properly by Charles, confirming she had been notified of the changes, and would not contest them. Nothing more dramatic than that. Nothing that pretended she was giving up something that had never truly belonged to her in the first place. There was no applause, no dramatic unmasking in front of a crowd. Just a quiet corner of a library, a notary's stamp, and the particular relief of a thing finally being put back in its proper order.